what I'm predicting and what I see from the data is that edge inference is going to dominate. Go to a YouTube video and learn how these chips are built at a fab. You would think you're looking at magic, this thing that happens in our tech universe time immemorial, which is that the more compute that is afforded to us, the more consumption, the more consumption, the more compute we need. So it's a cycle, it's a flywheel, it feeds itself. What Elon imagines is all that gets broken down by AI. AI can just generate the human request in real time and deliver results on screen in a way that is rich and doesn't create these modal boundaries between applications. So everything I just said, if done in real time by AI, drags in so much inference, it's eye popping. My personal belief is that, Tesla's on the leading edge of all aspects of this, and therefore that's a good place that I think to put money for me.
Well, as you know, AI is just undergoing a massive transformation across so many industries right now. And Nvidia has been a huge leader in that over the last few years. But has AI really gotten going yet? Or is the next transformation going to make what we've experienced so far look like small potatoes? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I've got Phil Beisel with me today. He is an ex-engineer from Apple, also has done some amazing work with Rivian. He was the founder of their tech team. So he is deep in the weeds on the hardware and software behind some of the world's leading edge technology products. And so we're going to be digging into the world of inference that we've been training these neural nets. Nvidia has made billions of dollars on that. But now it's time to put these neural nets to work, and that's where inference comes in. And so we're looking at the growth of that workload over time. And as we do that, we are potentially going to be moving into a world where inference is actually orders of magnitude greater than what we have experienced so far with training. And so this chart is a good, just directional look at what the future of inference could look like compared to training. And you see there that it's just growing and projected to grow at massive rates compared to where we've been. And so, yeah, the question is why? What drives this? And then what are the implications on the backside of this type of inference growth? So, yeah, thanks for being with me today, Phil, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so that chart comes out of that article that I wrote on inference compute is about to explode, and I think it is. And the simple why is we're now using it. It's AI in use is what inference is, right? So it's the use side. But what we have is we have an explosion of the generic, what I'll call generic use, which is like LMs, OpenAI, like ChatGPT, Grok, those types of tools. But now we're starting to see kind of an expansion of the use of AI, cross industries, and then in particular starting to push to the edge. And this is probably where, if you look at the chart, what I'm predicting and what I see from the data is that edge inference is going to dominate the inference case over cloud-based inference. So what we've done so far is we've trained models in the cloud. These are on large, coherent clusters. They demand a lot of compute. They run for weeks at a time. And because of that, we hear about them, right? We hear about them that everybody talks about, oh, it took, Colossus is this big or and so forth. But I think because inference happens on per use, we forget how much compute is being dedicated towards inference. And of course, by and large, the whole point of building a model is to get it to be put to use. And so over time, and probably quite quickly, the amount of inference compute swamps the original training compute by quite a lot. But what's happening is beyond these sort of use cases that we understand really well, like the AI assistants, we're starting to see inference move towards the edge. And that's the prediction here is not exactly what's happening now, but what will happen. And one of the points I make in the article is enter the robots. And what I'm specifically speaking about is technologies like Tesla's FSD, which powers robotaxi, and of course the AI that's will be resonant in the Optimus humanoid bot and all the competitive offerings is inference at the edge, right? And these are large scale inference compute devices that are power heavy. That isn't to take away from inference cases that are starting to happen at the edge with smaller devices like cell phones, but um, these are power constrained devices and therefore can't push as much on the inference. They can't move the needle on the chart as much as say FSD running in the vehicle, right? So
Yeah, and so can you dig into a little bit, what we're looking here is the overall number of, trillions of operations per second capacity. And you've got the yellow line that's edge inference, but then there's also the red line for cloud inference. What's the difference between the cloud inference? What situation is that used in? And
mm-hmm.
what does that hardware look like compared to the stuff that's happening at the edge?
Yeah, so cloud inference are all the cases where we're using inference and by remote, remote like every Grok session, every Chat GPT session, that's inference in the cloud. Um, and so that's largely on NVIDIA hardware for the most part today. Of course, if you're using, say, Google Gemini, you're using their TPUs. They have their own types of processors for inference. Um, so that's what's happening today in the cloud. And there's a lot of contributors to that are probably not seen. There's Dells and Oracles out there. Oracle is running data centers that do this. Heard rumors that a good portion of Grok's inference is done in an Oracle data center. Um, so today, if you download and use the Grok application on device, on your iPhone or Android device, all the AI is done in the cloud, and it's just a network connected device doing that. So it's sort of like a terminal to that. Um, and that's sort of where we think of inference today, right? That's 90% of the use case. But of course, as we push it out to the edge, uh, then it starts to get real, and there is this hope that eventually there'll be enough power on device, or the draw off the inference chips will be more nominal versus where they are today. They're here's the thing. We have put CPUs to use for, 30 plus years. And those CPUs have gotten faster and faster over time. And they've gone multi-core and, they've largely kept up with Moore's law. Um, uh, but the demands on them were fairly nominal. You know, Perhaps it was what was available, therefore the demand didn't try to, uh, overplay its hand. But the only peel off of that was the GPU early on, and we started to realize that, or Nvidia and a few other vendors started to realize that, well, we needed larger screens with more pixels, and we needed faster transitions and higher frame rates, and so a special processor got built called the GPU, and it was perfect for screens because the idea is that it did a bunch of parallel processing, and it, kind of thought of the screen as in pieces or pixels. Well, it turns out that some very smart people realized that it could be put to use for other types of compute, and beyond a bunch of scientific use cases. I think the two that we can speak of is things like Bitcoin mining as in the early days, and then of course now neural networks themselves. So these types of architectures for software, like a neural network, are just very, very compute hungry to the extreme. I mean, every time you ask ChatGPT a simple question with really no context, you're running billions of matrix multiply operations and on some GPU in the cloud.
That
I mean,
just
billions.
also happen to yield themselves to not necessarily having to be done one after the other, that you can do those billions and you can
Yeah,
do, you know, a bunch of them all at the same time on different little cores. And
yeah.
yeah, that's just
So
a different paradigm than CPU computation is done.
it is. I mean, what when we think of CPUs, we've naturally thought of them. I mean, at best, you might have a 8 to 16 core CPU. Therefore, the parallelism is kind of limited by, no matter what your operating system, if you had 16 cores, you only have 16 operations potentially running in parallel at any given moment. If the problem inherently can be parallelized, if it can be, if you can compute simultaneously and then, so-called merge the answer, then it begs the question, why wouldn't you give me more cores? Well, that's what a GPU does in effect. The problem, Hans, really is one of the weird things about this is we talk a lot about compute all the time. We talk about, tops and, trillions of operations a second, what the processors are rated for. The constraint isn't that at all. The constraint is the speed at which you can feed it with data, the latency of data. That is the number one constraint. So way you can manage that is either you can get data closer to the processor, to the core of the processor. Remember, this is a funny little simple physics problem. The further data is away from the processor, the longer it takes to get to the processor by nature of this thing called the speed of light. I mean, it's not really that more complicated. Um, so information works on a wire at about, I don't know, say 70% of the speed of light. So if you move it 3 inches, it still takes a certain number of cycles of that processor to get it from memory to the processor. So waiting on data is what processors do all the time. They are literally sitting there waiting on. So if you want to maximize the use of a processor, you've got to get data to it as quickly as possible. And in a GPU, the idea is that you're kind of just feeding one core, feeding the next core, and there's a massive parallelism so that you can keep pushing more data at it and it can keep processing that data. It comes back to the problem, though, which we started with, which is that the problem has to be inherently capable of breaking it into parts to be parallel. And so the interesting reality of neural networks is that they are exactly that. You can parallel process even one single matrix multiply operation is something you can do in parts. In other words, to think of it in simple terms, you could say, I want to take this one matrix and multiply it by another matrix, and it's 100 by 100 multiplied by 100 by 100, and I can send it off to 100 different people, and they can do their little piece, and then they can come back with the result. And that's kind of what we're doing in accelerated computing, or what we're doing at the core of a GPU.
And the math is actually something that breaks down so simple is that each person that has one of those pieces, they can just do addition and subtraction in their piece. Like they don't even have to do complicated division or multiplication.
No, there's only two operations in matrix math. It's addition and mult. So standard addition, standard multiplication, the stuff that we're all used to in life, that we've all been trained on. So it's actually, from a processor point of view, every processor has these math cores, right? And the math core allows it to do things like add two integers or add two floating point numbers, or multiply two integers, or multiply two floating point numbers. And those cores, if you can multiply those cores out massively in a kind of parallel framework, you can feed it with these matrices. And by doing so, like, if you ask Grok a simple question, what is the weather in Austin? I don't know how many words that is, but let's say it's 10. It's 10 tokens input. Words are kind of tokens, give or take. And that alone, against the size of the neural network that it's operating, will invoke at least close to, I would say, at least close to a trillion matrix multiply operations just to answer that question. I might be a little bit off on my math, but I'm not too far off. So that's a lot of compute. And the only way to do that rationally is to break the problem into parallel parts, which is what these GPUs are really, really good at.
I was actually letting Perplexity answer how long is, if a person were able to do one of those math operations per second, how long would it take them to do a trillion matrix math operations?
And what's the answer?
I have a hard time, checking the math on this, but it says 31,688 years to do a trillion. It says a million seconds is 11.5 days, a billion seconds is 31.7 years, and then a trillion is 31,688 years.
I mean, the fact that we measure these processors in tops, trillions of operations a second, I mean, just think about that for half a second. Trillions of operations a second. I mean, that is, it's unreal. I mean, it's really, I still think about that all often, and then what we're doing is we're rating these processors like, Elon was speaking last night at the All In podcast about the AI5 chip, their forthcoming inference chip for FSD and Optimus. And he was saying, I think something like 8 times the compute of AI4, or known as hardware 4. And to put that in perspective, that would be about 4,000 trillion operations a second that can run through that chip. I mean, so it's inference is a compute. It's a data bound, and I'm trying to say it's both a data bound because we're waiting on data a lot, but it becomes a compute bound problem because we can feed the data through multiple parallel components of the chip, right? And these chips are expected to process these billion plus, neural networks and come up with answers in short order, right? With the expectation, if you're, let's say that you're operating with a voice agent, like Grok Voice or one of those. I mean, your expectation is that the entire dialogue is real time. And don't forget, there's 2 things going on there. It's not only there's a neural network that's involved in voice recognition. So first task is we have to take voice and convert voice to text so we can form a prompt. The second task is to push the prompt through the large language model. And the third task is another neural network that synthesizes speech from text. So we have these 3 different neural network operations happening to simply answer a question. And the expectation for any human is that it's perceptibly in real time, right? So, that's pretty insane.
Well, and so I did another Perplexity search. It says that human brains are estimated to operate anywhere between 20,000 tops and 1,000,000 tops. So that's what we use to do real
What
time
we do.
conversation.
I'm not sure my brain goes that fast, but I mean, it's a
Maybe
it
Ben Shapiro.
yeah yeah. I think he talks fast. I don't know how fast his brain works, but I should say I rarely actually spend a lot of time thinking about how the human brain does a lot of these things because I feel like there's a lot of differences than things that I don't understand. But from a compute side, I mean, the compute stuff is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's a magic act to see it actually materialize, to see these chips. Um, I would encourage every reader to, go to a YouTube video and learn how these chips are built at a fab. It's You would think you're looking at magic. It's literally how the chips are, how the transistors are etched onto the surfaces by these machines, extremely expensive machines, um, and how these chips, ultimately are built is they're kind of the transistors are coupled together in these little logic cores, kind of like Legos, and there are things that know how to do and logic and or logic, and then they build up to things like additions and subtractions and multiplications, and these are well-known kind of transistor Lego components, and then they're coupled together to create this whole entire architecture, replicated and coupled together to create this architecture of this chip that can do, astounding number of these operations, um, in short order. And what's interesting is that, it's sort of this thing that happens in our tech universe time immemorial, which is that the more compute that is afforded to us, the more consumption, the more consumption, the more compute we need. So it's a cycle, it's a flywheel. It feeds itself, and there are certainly points where we're bounded, and we hold back because we don't have enough. Um, I mean, I think if you asked anybody that owns a large data center that computes one of these models, why they're not doing a model that's 10x the size of the model they just delivered, they would largely tell you it's a compute and energy problem. I mean, we've gotten into the place now where now we're starving this on an energy side as well, right? Um, what the power required to deliver to run these chips is extraordinary. The good news is if we push it to the edge, we kind of distribute the problem, and therefore it doesn't feel, and it normalizes itself as well, right? That the power normalizes itself, and it doesn't feel as much of a draw at any given spot at any given time. The bad news is that the use cases that you see in products like full self-driving and forthcoming Optimus push that inference, to the edge.
And the power consumption up, like we talked about, 10 times or more what the power consumption on a mobile device would be. So you're consuming a lot more energy, both for the work that you're doing as a robotaxi or as an Optimus robot, and you're doing a lot more energy into the token generation of controlling that device.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the iPhone at full draw, you might be pulling 15 watts off of it, running your most extreme video game, frame generation, or neural network, something that really pushes, but you can't sustain that. It's non-sustainable type of processing. Whereas one of the things about FSD is it's sustaining inference cycles at 15 to 30 times a second continuously the entire time the vehicle's operating. And it's not just doing it when you're in FSD mode, it's operating that when the car, we call it shadow mode, whenever you're in a Tesla, moving a Tesla, FSD is running. So Um, that's an extreme. In simple terms, that's in a lot of compute because it's happening all the time, whereas your cell phone is happening only sort of on demand. And we know that, we know that on a cell phone, the cell phone will heat up, will feel that, you know, um, and it has to bleed that heat because some of it just is lost in heat generation. Um, but the devices like something like FSD, we luckily we have more power to provide or more energy to provide. But we have a larger energy store, so we can provide more power to the processor. So like a processor like, geez, hardware 4, I think is running at least 100 watts draw, and it's running continuously, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
So
it's a little bit more than 100. And I know that like the Jetson Thor chip that Nvidia just announced is, I think, 120 to like 150, something
yeah,
like that.
so hardware 4 is rated to be max draw, I think, at 160, if I recall correctly. AI 5 could push that to potentially a max draw of 5 to 800 watts, right? To get, I mean, we're luckily talking about order of magnitude more processing and a more throughput too, because it's not just processing, it's getting the data there. So we have larger memory space. And um, so now we have these chips that draw, they're very power hungry, and luckily vehicles have large batteries. The downside of that is we want those batteries to mostly be used to move the wheels. So, so, um, so it, it's not, we don't want to waste power just in that system alone. But in order to do that, and the balance has been achieved. I mean, we can see that um, in full self driving, that that balance. There's a balance here. I think the way to think about this is we have an application, we have a power system, we have a certain amount of energy that's available to us. Can we run that effectively to deliver the application? And FSD, I think we have done that, or I shouldn't say we. Tesla has done that. It's an open question on how that happens with Optimus, because an Optimus battery um, is probably lower than or somewhere between 2 to 3 kilowatt hours in total capacity. So your sustained use of that for powering an AI5 processor is a bit suspect.
Yep. Yeah. If you think of, if we just said 3 kilowatt hours, and if you had to run at 500 watts, well, then you only get 6 hours of operation. And that's just to run the inference computer. That's not to move the robot. So yeah, you've got to fit that power usage down into a pretty small envelope, which I think people who are scared about the future of hardware 3 cars should think about that fact, that, they're going to want AI 5 to be able to operate very well in a very energy nerfed mode. That should mean that it retrofits into hardware 3 vehicles pretty easily, and can operate within the power envelope that's available to them in a hardware 3 vehicle. Yeah, so like I'm not too worried about hardware 3 vehicles' ability to get upgraded to hardware that will be able to keep up with, if not exceed, the performance of, hardware 4 today.
Yeah, I don't know what Tesla's actual strategy is for that. From an engineering point of view, there are some reasonable constraints in terms of um, the power draw is heavy and the heat dissipation, and is what's the size of these boards relative to the hardware 3 boards. I mean, I don't know the answers to that, but um, upgrading is always hard. There's lots of products that just simply don't have that. The upgrade cycle on an iPhone is to get a new one. Cars are obviously more expensive, so people are hoping that there's more of a swap out of the brain. Um, but it's time marches and these compute problems become bigger. And people often say, this is a great question that I love to answer. That's People often say, why would you, if it's sort of the gotcha question, right? If AI4 can run FSD and potentially, then why do you need AI5? Is FSD not safe in AI4 under AI4? And I guess is really kind of a silly way to look at it. What happens when you get something like AI5 is that sure you can run the inference side, you can run larger models, and of course we think of those larger models as being um, more having more decision points, having more nuance, um, and therefore potentially safer. Sure, yeah, no doubt. But then the use cases start to explode, and people forget about that. Today Tesla introduced Grok in the car. Well, Grok is not Grok is an application in the car, much like Grok's an application on your cell phone. All the inference is done remotely. If you lose connectivity in your vehicle, there is no Grok operating in your car. The future of that is that Grok and FSD operate on vehicle concurrently and together to create kind of one unified application. So remember what's happening now. We expect that we're going to be able to speak to our car. It's going to understand what we said. It By understand, I mean run it through the Grok LLM, and then it's going to speak to us all the time while it's doing, at the same exact moment that it's running inference 50 to 30 to 60 times a second.
which right now is a workload that takes multiple GPUs in a cloud somewhere far away in order to accomplish that. Use way more power than is available to your hardware 4 computer right now.
Yeah, and there's a lot to that. Part of it is hardware 4 just doesn't even have the memory architecture to support running a model like that. So if you look at hardware AI5, has about 10x, another order of magnitude more memory. So it's a lot to that to load the model and run the model. These LM models are big in size compared to their FSD cousin. But that architecturally they may look in, I mean, at some base level, architecturally, they're the same. They're neural networks, and those are, we can characterize those. But the size of them are vastly different, and therefore, the amount of memory required just to load the model and run inference through an LM is much greater than what's done on FSD. FSD, the other part about FSD, there's a bunch of engineers that hear these. There's a bunch of engineers at Tesla who hear us talking about this kind of stuff, and they continually say, "What about me?" And those are the engineers that are involved in the uh, tedious, rigorous process of getting the performance out of, to squeezing, to reducing that photon,
The latency.
to control latency, which is a huge part of the engine. I mean, it's probably 25% of the effort is just tuning it to fit. And there's lots of techniques that are done at the neural network model level, sure, but a lot of it is just counting all the cycles, looking at the processor, trying to figure out why is it waiting on data, where's the data, why aren't we feeding it data? If it can consume data, why are we going to allowing it to wait, which is increasing that latency, and then coming up against a condition where we're like, well, we must achieve 15 times a second or 30 times a second, whatever their inference rate is. So that tuning of these things is an extreme amount of engineering that people just sort of like, yeah, that happens. But it's no different than the day you pick up the latest greatest release of iPhone, whatever the current iOS release will be, and then you realize, that thing draws, what is the constant complaint? As soon as it drops, my battery, yeah, people make that up, but it's also true in some cases. And then they spend the next 3 months, looking at all the different use cases of what's running the CPU hot and trying to, uh, tune it. And
Yeah.
that's the same thing that's happening here. Yeah.
So let's move now to, I mean, we've talked about Optimus as a use case for inference. We've talked about Robotaxi, Cybercab as a use case for inference. These are going to be two example applications that really drive that huge demand growth for inference compute. But what are some other things that you see like as broad categories or specific use cases that are going to continue to just demand more and more of this intelligence?
What I think is true is that we'll start to reimagine how we're using, um, like we have these AIs. How can we reimagine them in ways that would ultimately consume more compute? And a great example that I use, and I wrote this into this article, was I leaned in on this thing called the bitstream. And this is about 3 months or so ago, Elon started to leak, or I don't know what the right word is, start talking. He started talking about it, on X, saying it's just processing. All these AIs are just processing bits. So one example of pushing inference to the next level is video games in real time. That there are, no solid video game binaries sitting around. That the reality is that all the video game is just generative AI, and it's happening in real time. And that's the key. It's happening in real time. Like we see generative AI today in terms of videos and little short clips of videos like Grok Imagine, or longer things, but those things are not necessarily generated in real time. We upload the image to Grok and we watch it click away, and it takes 30 seconds, and it delivers a 6-second video. So 30 seconds to deliver 6 seconds is not real time. But in order to do a video game in real time at a massive frame rate, where the world is sort of just generative, requires a massive amount of compute, and per GPU, right? So that's a case. Another case that Elon spoke about within this confines of this bitstream was that he formed this. I guess I don't know if it's a new company, but he's named it MacroLard, which is a play on the term Microsoft. And what he's saying is that the future of applications are the same thing. That an application isn't like today we think of as Microsoft goes and creates Excel or Word, and we download these applications, we install them on our laptops, and then of course there's a whole sea of applications on mobile devices these days, and they're all people use the word binaries. In other words, they're the produced code of the efforts of tens to dozens to hundreds of engineers over a period of time, and then they are fixed in their function. We can use them in where we can use them in unconstrained ways within the constraints of their features, right? And they're broken up in suites of applications, which there's word processing kind of model, Word and spreadsheets and PowerPoint and presentation apps and so forth. And what Elon imagines is all that gets broken down by AI. AI can just generate the human request in real time and deliver, results on screen in a way that is largely indistinguishable, but actually much more rich than today's applications. So we could say things like, here's a set of data, lay this out in a tabular format, in other words, like a spreadsheet, and make sure that we're looking at the average of this column of data. Let's build some pretty graphs. uh, let's put this into a presentation. Let's take it and also create an article, a larger format article. All this just talking to a device and having it respond to us in a way that is rich and doesn't create these modal boundaries between applications. So everything I just said, if done in real time by AI, drags in so much inference, it's eye popping. Um, that's the bounding box for. There's a lot of technical things to get there, just like there's a lot of technical things to get FSD to its actual finish line. But one of the bounding constraints there is raw inference compute, for sure.
And so as someone who, does a little bit of investing here and there, why, with that thesis, what companies do you invest in on the back of that, and why would you choose them specifically? Of course, not financial advice for people, but just a peek into your thinking on the landscape.
Well, I mean, instead of speaking about general companies, it's sort of like we have to look at the trend. A lot of times, a lot of tech investors are early on some of these, adopting these things before they, we're in a phase where stuff is being realized in a more compressed time frame. And the danger to that sometimes is investing in these things that you invest in something and there's no staying power because someone very quickly usurps it in the market with some other way of doing it that's better in some dimension. So I look, for me, I think of companies like the people who made a lot of money in the AI space have really focused on the infrastructure side, the Nvidia types of plays. And certainly I think if I look at something like Tesla, I think, well, this is a long play here because, you not only are they creating the infrastructure side in the compute itself, but they're creating these demonstrable, defensible applications of inference. And in terms of the raw software space, I always get a little bit like I don't see the emergent play that is something long term. Like if you looked at any of the, like for example, I mean, if OpenAI were to go public tomorrow and someone says, well, let's invest in OpenAI, that might work for a period of time. But if Grok comes along and crushes it, it sort of has with Grok 4, and Grok 5 just kind of completely crushes it, and it's left holding on to the past, then would that have been a good long-term investment? So, I don't really know the answers. I think that we're at this phase in the market where the velocity of change is so much that there's not a lot of stability, and kind of plays to the trader's advantage. But I don't, I think trading equities, trading stocks is really hard. So you'd rather buy and hold them, and the best possible way is to play infrastructure for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, Nvidia has definitely done extremely well. A lot of people are looking at AMD right now. It's interesting to see what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Oracle had a huge pop recently, and likely that is due to what you said earlier, that if xAI is outsourcing, because they don't have nearly the total in-house compute infrastructure that a lot of these other companies have, since they're not working with Microsoft Azure or Amazon AWS or Google Cloud or any of these big hyperscalers. If they want to use Colossus purely for training, then that means Colossus has no inference budget, and that inference has to happen somewhere else. And
Right.
Yeah,
Correct.
if Oracle's the one who's on tap for that, then they could be seeing, massive demand growth for inference.
I mean, to simplify what I was saying is that if you look across the sea of AI assistants, AKLMs, and you're saying, well, where would I invest? Well, um, your best lower risk, higher return thing is probably infrastructure. And, it's not to say that there aren't winners in the market. There will be, and they'll emerge. And well, but I don't know, and perhaps they'll dominate just as companies like Apple in the past and Microsoft in the past have dominated. I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to predict that. My personal belief is that um, Tesla's on the leading edge of um, all aspects of this, and therefore that's a good place that I think to put money for me.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Phil. I think maybe this is a good place to wind it down for today, and we'll definitely come back and do more of these. Let me know when your next article comes out, and we can do a good synopsis on that again. Yeah, this was really fun. I love thinking about the inference side of things. So yeah, it's great to really pull the curtain back a little bit and think through some of those questions a little bit deeper.
Well, yeah, thanks. It's been great.
All right. Well, hope everyone who's watching this, if you made it this far, congratulations, you're a trooper.
Yeah, exactly.
And follow Phil Beisel on X at P Beisel and PBEISEL. And he's out there. He writes great articles. Like we said at the beginning, he's got a phenomenal background. So someone that you can always look to for good inside baseball knowledge on all of this stuff.